As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall.
The gates of Buckingham Palace have never felt heavier than they do today. Not since the abdication crisis of 1936 has the British monarchy stood at such a crossroads. But what is unfolding right now behind those imposing iron gates makes that moment look like a rehearsal. King Charles III, the man who waited 7 decades for the crown, the man who buried his mother, stood in the rain at her funeral, and carried the weight of an entire nation on his aging shoulders. He is stepping down, not quietly, not with a whispered resignation or a carefully managed press release. King Charles is preparing to deliver a final address to the nation, a farewell to power that will formally declare the beginning of the reign of King William V and Queen Catherine. But here is what the official palace statements will never tell you. The real story behind this abdication did not begin in a throne room. It began in a private meeting room, with a woman scorned, a son finally trusted, and a king who found the steel he had been searching for his entire life. What drove Charles to this moment? What really happened when Queen Camilla shattered the silence at that secret family gathering? Stay with us, because this story goes far deeper than a coronation announcement. To understand why King Charles is abdicating, you have to understand what wearing that crown actually cost him. Charles was not born to be a relaxed monarch. He was born to wait. For decades. Through scandal, through heartbreak, through the loss of the most beloved princess the world had ever seen. When Queen Elizabeth II passed in September 2022, Charles was 73 years old, the oldest person in British history to ascend to the throne. His coronation in May 2023 was magnificent. Gold pageantry, ancient ritual. The world watched. And for one brief moment, it seemed as though this complicated, deeply private man had finally arrived at his destiny. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing. Almost immediately, the shadows gathered. His cancer diagnosis in early 2024 sent a chilling message through the institution. The king was mortal. The succession was urgent. And the internal fracture that had been quietly widening beneath the surface of royal life became impossible to ignore. Harry and Meghan's bombshells from across the Atlantic, Andrew's permanent shame, a press that never rested, a public mood that was shifting in ways no ceremony could reverse. William and Catherine, however, were different. Through Catherine's own devastating cancer diagnosis and her extraordinary recovery, through William's increasingly confident appearances on the world stage, something remarkable was happening. The British public was falling in love with them, profoundly, genuinely, in a way that reminded older generations of a princess who had walked those same gilded halls 3 decades before. Charles saw it, and the question that must have kept him awake at Sandringham was this: at what point does a king's greatest act of service become the act of stepping aside? Nothing about what happened next was announced, no leaks, no official channels. And yet, inside the private meeting rooms of Buckingham Palace, a gathering took place that would alter the course of British royal history. The room told you everything about the weight of the moment. Crystal chandeliers, royal portraits on every wall, and around the long table, the faces of the family Charles had spent his entire reign trying to hold together. William arrived with the composed bearing of a man who sensed the magnitude of what was coming. Beside him, Catherine, hands folded neatly in her lap, the very picture of the stability the British public had craved for years. And then there was Queen Camilla, present, watchful, her expression carefully neutral. Charles rose to speak. From the first sentence, the room understood this was not a routine briefing. His voice was low, steady, but carrying a finality that could not be walked back. He spoke of time, of duty, of the weight that declining health places on a sovereign who refuses to acknowledge his own limitations. And then he said it. He formally declared his intention to abdicate, to transfer the sovereign power of the crown to William and Catherine. The room plunged into a silence so profound that the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece sounded like thunder. William's jaw tightened. Catherine's composure held, but her eyes betrayed everything. This was real. This was happening. And then came the sound that shattered it all. The sharp scrape of a chair across stone. Queen Camilla rose. What would possess a woman who had fought her entire life for the legitimacy she finally possessed to stand up and challenge the king himself? The woman who rose was not the warm, self-deprecating Camilla the public had come to accept. Her eyes burned with something sharper, something defiant. William, she argued, was too young, too inexperienced. The timing was catastrophically premature. The words sounded reasonable. They were designed to. But the room watched her hands, the way her fingers tightened on her handbag, the tremor at the corner of her mouth. These were not the movements of a concerned stateswoman. These were the movements of a woman watching her life's work being dismantled in real time. Because the truth every person in that room understood was this: Camilla's entire identity had been built around one axis, her role as the power beside Charles, the queen consort who had transformed herself from the most reviled figure in British public life into an accepted member of the royal family. Take Charles's power away, and what exactly remains? Her interruption struck the room like a blade through silk. Charles stood frozen. This was not a political opponent. This was the woman he had loved for most of his adult life, the woman for whom he had endured decades of public hatred, and she had just humiliated him publicly in front of his son, his daughter-in-law, and the people to whom he was attempting to pass the most sacred trust in British public life. It was William who steadied the moment. He rose without drama, moved to his father's side, and with the quiet authority of a man already operating from a position of power, announced that the meeting would adjourn. Graceful, decisive, and sending a message impossible to misread. As Camilla disappeared through those grand doors, everyone left in the room understood one thing: nothing inside Buckingham Palace would ever be the same again. If stories like this are what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what's coming next. The door to the king's private study closed like a verdict being delivered. Charles stood gripping the edge of the oak desk, his knuckles white. Camilla had followed him. She stood in the center of the room, chin lifted, performing confidence while her eyes betrayed real fear. The kind that arrives when a person realizes they have pushed things past the point of retrieval. What she said next represents perhaps the single most consequential act of misjudgment in the modern history of the royal family. She reached back past the crown, past the decades of shared life, into the darkest corners of Charles's most guarded personal history. She invoked Gordonstown boarding school, the place Charles once described as a kind of private hell, the loneliness, the bullying, the profound unhappiness of a sensitive boy with no emotional rescue in sight. She had known these things because Charles had trusted her with them. In their most intimate moments, he had whispered to her the parts of himself he had shown no one else. And now she made clear through implication, through calculated suggestion, that those secrets need not remain private. It was a threat, breathtaking, catastrophic, irreversible, and it did not break Charles. It rebuilt him. He turned around slowly, and the eyes that met hers were not the eyes of the man she thought she knew. The vulnerability that had defined him for decades, the endless search for approval, the need for validation, was gone. In its place was something harder, something final. He understood in that instant that the woman before him had not been the refuge he believed. She had been a kind of captor, and the cage door had just swung open. He stepped to his desk, picked up his fountain pen, and began to write. He did not speak to her. He did not acknowledge her. She had walked in intending to break him. She had instead broken something between them that nothing would ever repair. Later that night, Charles walked the palace corridors with a different step. The tentativeness that had always marked his bearing was gone. His footsteps struck stone with a purpose those walls had never heard from him before. He was heading toward the apartments of the Prince of Wales. When William opened the door, no preamble passed between them. Charles sat down and told his son everything. Every detail of what Camilla had said. Every threat. Every weaponized memory. He said it plainly, without the varnish royals typically apply to family dysfunction. William listened with extraordinary stillness. His face revealed nothing, but his hands gripping the arms of his chair betrayed the quiet fury beneath. In his father that night, William saw two things simultaneously: the king, betrayed, and the father, the complicated, flawed, deeply human man who had always struggled to close the distance between them, now reaching across it completely. What passed between them was not merely political alliance. It was the transfer of genuine trust between two men who shared blood and burden across a generation of misunderstanding. William was not simply supportive. He was immediately strategic, mapping the next steps, The guest list, the framing, the sharp, decisive mind behind his careful public image now fully visible. When Charles placed his hand on William's shoulder before leaving, something irreversible had been completed. The succession had already happened. Not in a throne room. In a lamplit study, before dawn, between a king stepping back and a king stepping forward. The second meeting was surgical. Every element considered in advance. The seating arrangement alone told the story before a word was spoken. William and Catherine positioned closer to the king than ever before. Camilla arrived in emerald velvet, her presentation deliberate. The armor of a woman who understood optics were now her only weapon. But the moment she read the room, the color drained from her expression. She swept the table for allies. She found none. Every face returned careful, impenetrable neutrality. The winds had changed overnight. Charles rose and spoke with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. He restated the abdication. He laid out the roadmap in irreversible detail. He did not look toward Camilla once. That deliberate absence, the complete disappearance of the instinct to seek her reaction that had defined decades of their relationship, was the loudest statement in the room. Camilla tried. A slight shake of the head, a timed sigh. But then her eyes met William's, and she stopped. Because what she saw there was not a threatened son. It was a sovereign watching a political error unfold in slow motion, perfectly still, hands flat on the table, radiating an authority that needed no words. Beside him, Catherine equally resolute. Together they were something Camilla had not anticipated. An impenetrable wall of generational purpose that made her resistance look not just ineffective, but faintly absurd. The document was placed on the table. William accepted it from his father with quiet reverence. Catherine's smile was not triumphant. It was the smile of a woman who understood completely what she was now accepting. Camilla sat motionless, eyes on the fading light across the wall. The era she had spent her life navigating toward had closed behind her like a door pulled shut by someone else's hand. The palace scheduled the formal address. King Charles would speak to the nation. A final speech from a reign defined by patience, complexity, and one extraordinary act of self-sacrifice at its end. That morning, the palace had a different quality to its silence. Staff moved through the corridors with the awareness of people living inside history. William and Catherine were present. George, Charlotte, and Louis somewhere within those same walls. The next generation of a dynasty that would carry this name forward for centuries. Charles dressed quietly, not in the regalia of state, not in military splendor. The understated dress of a man surrendering power with grace rather than performing it. He stood at the podium and looked out at the cameras and the press and the people who had watched him across his entire public life. And he began. He spoke of his mother and the standards she set that no monarch could reasonably hope to exceed. He spoke of service as the lived daily practice of placing duty above every personal desire and every personal wound. He spoke of William with a warmth that surprised those closest to him. The sharpness of his mind, the depth of his empathy, the iron in his resolve. He spoke of Catherine, her capacity for connection, her steadiness, her gift for making the institution feel human without diminishing it. He said this abdication was not retreat. It was the greatest act of service still available to him. He did not mention Camilla once, and in that silence, the British public understood everything they needed to know about what had happened behind those palace walls. He ended simply. He looked into the camera and told the people of Britain that the crown's greatest strength had never been the person wearing it. It had always been the people standing beneath it. And then King Charles III stepped back from the podium. The reign was over. Charles retreated to Highgrove. Those who saw him there described something unmistakable: relief. He walked his gardens. He tended his land. He slept deeply for the first time in years. The man who waited 7 decades for the crown had worn it for fewer than 3, and history's early verdict seemed clear. His greatest act as monarch was knowing when to stop. Camilla withdrew to Ray Mill House. The separation from Charles, never confirmed, never denied, became simply a fact the palace managed with silence. She fulfilled obligations. She maintained composure, but the rooms around her were emptier. The warmth the institution had once extended to her had quietly, permanently withdrawn. William and Catherine stepped forward with a confidence that seemed stored up across years of watching and waiting. The crowds responding to them were not responding to symbols. They were responding to people. Real, knowable human people carrying ancient weight with visible purpose and genuine grace. So here is the question that remains. Was Camilla's decision to weaponize Charles's most private memories the defining mistake of her royal story? Or was it simply the moment a truth that had always been present finally became impossible to hide? Because ambition at that level never disappears. It manages, it adapts, it presents as wisdom and concern, until the moment of genuine threat arrives, and the mask slips, and what you see underneath is what was always there. The monarchy will survive this. It has survived Edward VIII. It survived Diana. It will absorb this and continue. But the institution William and Catherine inherit is more exposed, more scrutinized, and operating on a narrower margin for error than at any point in living memory. They both know it. You can see it in how they move through the world now. William carrying his mother's warmth alongside something sharper and more strategic that is entirely his own. Catherine carrying an authority forged not by title, but by personal fire, by illness and recovery, and the quiet rebuilding of herself under pressure most people will never face. The new era has begun, and the story of Charles's abdication is ultimately a story about the cost of keeping something ancient alive in a world that moves faster than any institution can comfortably manage. He gave up the crown. But before he did, he gave up something harder. The belief that love, even hard-won, fiercely defended love, survives when the true nature of a relationship is finally revealed. Do you think Charles made the right call? Was this the act of a wise king at peace with his legacy, or the final surrender of a man who spent his whole life being moved by forces beyond his control? And what about Camilla? Desperate mistake or the truest expression of who she always was? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. I read every single one. If this story moved you, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Because with this family, history never stops moving, and neither do we.